Welcome to the Space Alvey Institute podcast. I'm Andrew Petiprin with Bobby Mixa. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. We have had the pleasure over the last several weeks of having some excellent guests, and we have a number of really great guests lined up for the next few weeks after today and beyond. It is really a great pleasure that so many people are interested in sharing our work with us and sharing their work with us and collaborating with us and talking. So it's been really terrific. We really believe that we're creating this catalog, this library of great conversations that are going to be a resource for the future. But Bobby and I also want to have conversations with each other and share them with you about our rationale behind starting the Space Alvey Institute and some of what our hopes and dreams are for the future. So we thought today that we would take the opportunity to talk to each other about our own interest in Europe. And we wanted to start by pointing out something before we kind of get into some personal anecdotes and reflections. For those who have not yet read our manifesto on our website, I want to encourage everybody to go over there and take a look and see what you think. Many of you will have already read it, but if you haven't, I want to encourage you to do so. The name of our manifesto is Christian Hope in Europe for the Life of the World. So right there from the start, and you've already got this impression if you've listened to us or watched us already, we talk about Europe a lot. It's to some, it might be kind of a niche identity, right? But we believe it's actually maybe, at least for people like us, for people who are interested in what we're doing, maybe the most important place to focus our attention when we're thinking about the renewal of Christianity. I want to share one thing from the manifesto and then throw it over to Bobby to begin our reflections on our interest in Europe. In our manifesto, we wrote this in one paragraph. From almost the earliest days of Christianity, the continent and peoples of Europe have been the stewards of hope, the great gift of our heavenly sovereign. It is no accident that Saints Peter and Paul were called to Europe to be the vanguard of paganism's demise and to serve as the founding fathers of Christendom. Since then, even amid official versions of secularism, a Christian mark, as Pierre Manon calls it, has remained constantly visible throughout the European continent, inviting rediscovery and refreshment. I believe this very much to be true, and I know you do as well, Bobby. So let me throw it over to you, who are in Europe presently, to get the ball rolling as we go back and forth here in this conversation about what our impressions are of Europe. What is Europe? Where do we as Americans belong in the conversation about European identity? And more importantly, the connection of Europe to Christianity. What do you think?
Well, I was thinking about something D.C. Schindler said a while ago, and I think it was maybe in our conversation with him, but he mentioned that perhaps maybe it would take Americans to go to Europe and to rediscover or to see at least the culture, the Catholic culture that still is there, that many Europeans themselves don't even perhaps notice, or just see as something that's kind of like this toy that they played with and now they've moved on. But being an American and going back to my first time in Europe when I was in college and the study abroad program in Spain, particularly Madrid, I had just that experience. I felt like I experienced kind of a encultured Catholicism for the first time. And it really kind of, I don't know, it really left a mark on me. And a lot of the things I've been interested in over the years is actually is in some ways exploring that experience a little further, understanding it and understanding Europe, but also bringing some of that and hoping to bring some of that to Americans who in many ways, just like me, grew up in a suburban, suburbia, typical American suburbia, while being from, the Chicagoland area, which is heavily Catholic, but still noticing a big difference between the Catholicism at home and the Catholicism experienced abroad, and feeling like the Catholicism at home perhaps did not become encultured. And I'm not going to say encultured in like in a particular way, but perhaps something else was actually the lived culture. And Catholicism was much more seen like a private thing, a private faith that one held, and that kind of was reduced to, in a way, subjectivity. That's like your opinion, man, as the
Yeah.
dude says. So, Andrew, I don't know. We've talked over the years. I mean, I know you've when we were working together years ago, we oftentimes would talk about these our first experience in Europe. So, what was yours like? And maybe you could maybe not get into. You don't have to get into that just now, but did anything just resonate with you?
Well, I grew up, maybe you did too. Well, let me ask you first before I go in. Did you grow up, even though you didn't go to Europe until I guess you were in college?
Yeah.
And you and I both grew up in kind of American suburbia where the American thing is, it is, we'll talk about this, but is a kind of cultural force that is in many ways very much at odds with Catholic culture in certain respects. But did you grow up in your family with a distinct sense of having been European? Like your parents, your grandparents, like some sense
Yeah.
that like ultimately like that's where you came from.
Yeah, this is yeah, it's funny you bring that up because I think more than others, my family, more than like my other peers in school. I remember my dad and my mom were very interested in the family lineage, and my dad, we had my dad's grandparents, so my great grandparents, they came over from the former Austro-Hungarian Empire, right when World War One broke out. They came over to the United States, and so we had that. And my dad's dad's side, his father came over from Germany, and I didn't know much about my grandpa's father from Germany, but just the name Mixa. Learned a little bit about that later. But we always had this sense of coming from Europe, being still kind of immigrants, while being fully American and embracing that American identity, loving being very patriotic Americans, still having the sense that our roots are actually European. On my mom's side, the same thing. My mom's side, her grandpa, so my grandma's father, was Irish, and so there was always a great, and especially where I grew up in Chicago, a lot of Irish. In fact, my neighbor growing up next to me, Mr. Murphy, and then we had another neighbor just down the street. They were both from Ireland, and I always kind of took pride in being close to like a European. But the my mom's side really was interested in that the Irish identity. They came from County Clare, but then on my mom's dad's side, I did not know. I never met my grandpa because he died a couple of years before I was born. But um, my mom stayed in touch with her Aunt Rita, and she used to get letters like not to forget her identity and where the family came from. And so that was always it was a stress on. We knew it was from like Germany or perhaps even Luxembourg. And we're still, I have to look into this, but a little confused. But my mom was sure it's Trier, Germany. And we always kind of took great pride in that, if that is indeed the case, because it's, I think, one of the oldest cities in Germany. And I don't know if this may not strike many people as something to take pride in, but it's also where Karl Marx is from. So, anywho,
Interesting.
perhaps they were ancestors were neighbors or something like that. So yeah, we were always connected to, and I always had this orientation to Europe. And my great uncle Paul, who was my confirmation sponsor, I mean, he grew up speaking Croatian, in home because his mom was ethnically, I think Austrian, um, and his dad was from like Split, Croatia. And so they both grew up. She grew up in a region where they spoke Croatian as well, in addition to
Hmm.
German. And he spoke Croatian as a kid, and he always referred to the old country. So I always, in something, he was my perhaps like even more so than my grandpa. There's somebody who was very close to, looked up to. He fought in World War II, and he always was talking about the old country. So.
Yeah. I think your story is very common among, and it resonates with my experience growing up too. And I think it's one of those things that it's very common among Americans, right? That we sort of are interested in our, in the different kind of mishmash of European identities that we embody. And I remember, being in Europe and living in England for a while and getting to know, having dear friends who are English and from Europe and all that sort of thing. And it's definitely a different. It's You don't have that same sense of like this mixed identity that's all sort of European, but kind of coming from all these different places, right? Um, in my family, all four of my grandparents were Protestants, and so there definitely was not a sense of a like an immigrant mentality or like a connection to the old country per se, but there was definitely a lot of talk about that origin. So like my grandmother on my dad's side was Pennsylvania German, my grandfather on my mother's side was German American. My grandmother on my mother's side was kind of, Scots, Irish, English, and then my grandfather on my dad's side was Petiprin. That's where our name comes from, French and French Swiss. But something that was interesting about my upbringing was my father, who died last year. And because my grandfather was a naval officer, both my grandfathers were in the military in World War II, but my grandfather on my dad's side stayed in, and he was a career naval officer. His assignment in the 1960s was as naval attaché to NATO in Paris. And so my dad and my aunt grew up for basically the most significant part of their upbringing, kind of their middle period of like elementary school through middle school. They came back. My dad came back and went to high school in America, but before that, he grew up in France. He went to an English speaking school, but also learned French there and lived in a French community and everything. So my dad spoke fluent French his entire life. He then became a naval officer himself, and he ended up serving in Europe quite a bit. He was on the Sixth Fleet staff in Gaeta, Italy, and he served in Bosnia and served with NATO troops there. So anyway, the picture that I'm painting is the house that I grew up in with that side of my family, which was a pretty strong influence on me. What always had this sense of having lived in Europe, not just having been from Europe anciently, but having actually lived there. So my grandparents had they had a French piano that they brought back from France, right? They had like all this furniture that they had acquired, and they kept it for decades, right? And my dad always had a little bit of this sense of his own identity was like he was a very patriotic American and served in the American military, but also he spoke French. He was very interested in all these different cultures. He studied geography and kind of European geography and stuff like that. So anyway, so that's kind of the world that I grew up in. And last thing before I throw it back to you, sticking with my childhood for a moment, I mentioned that my dad served in Europe as a naval officer. That happened right as my parents were getting divorced when I was 13. The original plan actually was in 1993. Well, in 1992, the end of 1992, my dad was transferred from his post in Tampa, Florida, to Gaeta, Italy. And our whole family, we were going to finish the school year, the 1992-1993 school year, and then we were all going to move to Italy and join him. But for various reasons we don't need to go into here, that didn't happen. My parents got divorced instead, and so we stayed in Florida, but my dad was in Italy. The following summer, 1994, my sister and I, my middle sister and I, went to Italy and spent the whole summer, or most of the summer, with my dad. And that was my first time in Europe. I was 14 years old. I had just taken 1 year of French before that in eighth grade. And so I was just beginning to fall in love with kind of European culture myself at the time that I got to go to Europe for the first time and have this great experience going to Italy, Austria, Germany, and France. So, for my part, both kind of because of my father and then because of the experience that he provided for me, in a sense, I, from a very early age, had the sense that I too was certainly an American. My passport is blue and it's got an eagle on it, and that's the way it's going to be, right? Uh, and I'm married to an American woman. I have American children. I live in the United States of America. I probably always will. But that I always had this strong sense that I also had a home that was across the Atlantic. So that's one just personal reason going back to my origins that I feel very strongly about all this sort of thing. So I don't know, throw it back to you for your next part of your story, maybe.
No, it's funny you say that you feel like you always had a home across the Atlantic. My dad got in touch with his great grandfather's side, the Vujevics out in Split. And so I think, this is going back like maybe 15 years even. They started a correspondence, and my dad has been out there with my mom a couple times, and I think they're going to actually go there when they come to Krakow as well. They're going to go to various parts of Croatia, but to visit the extended family in Split. But my dad always takes great pride in that, and it's always kind of the highlight for him to go back to these regions that his his ancestors were in, and also to meet various people in the family who actually have similar personalities as other people in the family, and it's always interesting to just see that. And so, and my dad's always been interested in Europe. I mean, my dad, when I was I think it was actually maybe in the eighth grade too, my dad started learning how to make wine. And there was my uncle Timmy has a Croatian side as well. And so there was a group of Croatian guys who you could just go, anybody could come and then learn how to make wine. And my dad just went to hang out with these like old Croatian men, and he just learned how to make it because his ancestors were doing that. And so my dad took up winemaking, and every year my dad was making wine, but we kind of felt still like connected to the old world. But when I was young, I was fascinated by maps. I was just like so into maps. And when I remember I got this big map book. I think like when I was in like the 5th or 6th grade, and I just had this plan. I was like, I have to get to Europe. So I just drew out on this plan. I used to show people this, like how I would actually go through the Great Lakes, through the St. Lawrence, and then make my way down maybe the coast to Florida. But I would just go straight up to Europe. And it seemed like that was something like I don't know, pilgrimage destination of kinds. I always would make my way around the world, but Europe was always the highlight. I mean, I think I'd spend most of the time there. Maybe docked in one of these ports that your dad was close to.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I had a similar fascination with maps and flags and kind of all of that sort of thing always growing up. And I had the great opportunity in high school. So right after, just 10th through 12th grade, not my 9th grade year, but right after I did this big trip with my sister and my dad, our dad, I changed schools and I went into this international studies magnet program at a public high school where I got to take French and German for the rest of my time. And I got to take another trip to Europe as a school, like as part of a school trip. And that was really terrific. And on that trip, I actually went to England for the first time as well. And I went to Oxford. And I remember thinking, I think this is like God's own city. That's what I thought about Oxford the first time I went there. And I loved C.S. Lewis. I loved J.R.R. Tolkien. I loved, my whole imagination, even though I was taking French and German and had this kind of very strong interest in continental Europe, I also thought this is where I would like to be. And sure enough, my plan coming out of my undergraduate years, I don't know if I've ever told you this, Bobby, but my plan was I got to do another study abroad thing in France when I was an undergraduate, majored in French. And my plan was I was going to move to France. I was going to go be a teaching assistant through the Fulbright program. And I applied for that and I got it. But at the same time that I got that, I got the British Marshall Scholarship, which gave me, a scholarship to study at a British university. And so I did that instead. So it's so weird. I had this whole plan in my mind. I'm going to move to France. I'm going to be a teacher. I'm going to see what comes with that, maybe end up doing a PhD in French or something like that. And instead I moved to England, which was, just for so many reasons that we don't have time to get into here. But I mean, that was just such an awakening for me intellectually, just personally. I mean, just as a young man, I strongly recommend young men like in their early 20s have some kind of adventure. And this one turned out to be mine. But before I throw it back to you, the point that I'm building to here is all those trips that I had made, the trip with my dad, and then a trip in high school, and another kind of study abroad opportunity in college, I was always drawn to churches. I was always drawn to museums, but drawn to them in the sense of visiting something sacred. It was all kind of sacred. That all the sacredness was what I felt so profoundly in Europe, right? When I got to England, I remember, everybody said, well, it's so secular over there and all that kind of thing. But basically, the thing that I did more than anything else from the very beginning of my time in England was go to church. I was like, I couldn't even believe it. Like our college chapel had this incredible choral service every single night. And I'm like, how can people not be here? This is crazy. Like, how can you live in a place where you get to worship in these incredible buildings with this incredible music and liturgy and all this sort of thing, and you don't do it? So I did. And that set me off in a different path, of course. But I don't know if you felt that same sense of kind of the sacred that really is different than what you find anywhere in America.
Yeah, but it's interesting because I feel like everything in some ways is connected to that. So like what I love to do when I was in Madrid, so I did like a study abroad program in Madrid because St. Louis University has like a campus there. But my favorite thing to do, and I think this was my accidental education. I just happened to be more educated on the streets, not in like Spanish gangs or anything like that, but on the streets of Madrid, I felt like that was really my education because like I just love to observe people, places, and the way that in some ways there's just social harmony there. Everything has kind of like a hierarchical order in which, yeah, the worship is in some ways at the pinnacle of that. And maybe the Europeans themselves, I mean, Spaniards, I mean, that was interesting to see, the way they lived. I mean, the McDonald's were definitely packed. Not so much the churches, but the McDonald's. Yeah. But nevertheless, I felt like everything was ordered to the worship of God, and I felt like that it was like some of the kind of this incarnational principle really, really took hold of Spain. I was so fascinated by that. So that was like for me. I mean, I've been trying to kind of better articulate this experience, but yeah, in some ways, like the Christian principle took form there, and you saw it in the buildings. You saw it in even like Holy Week is coming. We're filming this right before Holy Week. I remember my first experience of Holy Week, and I was in Portugal then, but I remember just seeing like, oh my gosh, everything is in a way, time is different. The way that they're celebrating, like I remember being in this little chapel on Good Friday, and just the way they had the statue of like a dead Christ, and the way people adored Christ, and then they processed with him out into the city with candlelight. It just moved me so much that I've kind of been just chasing that experience again and again. And on Sunday, we're actually going to go off to we live like 10 minutes away from Kalwaria Jabudowska, which is where they have the great, Passion play and Way of the Cross that all like Polish people, they all know about this. This is where John Paul II, Wadowice is 10 minutes in the other direction. But this is John Paul II must have been at this Passion Play as a child and just grew up with this. Um, and he also said, when I die, when he came here first time as Pope, he said, when I die, I want people to pray for me right here. This is where I discern my vocation. But you could see that in the whole landscape too of Calvario Jablonska is marked by the way of the cross. It's just quite beautiful. And so this is kind of like something, it's like the total antithesis of this kind of privatized faith that I grew up in. But still, Chicago, I think, still has it in some ways, because you have so many European immigrants. I mean, Chicago had more Czechs in it than Czechs in Prague. I mean, it was at one point the largest, I think, Czech city in the world. And the same, I mean, I'm not sure if it was more than Warsaw, but it was definitely second to Warsaw for Poles. And, the Poles built these great heavenly churches. And so when you come into Chicago on like Stevenson, especially, which is the way we used to come into Chicago, or you're coming down on the Kennedy and you see the skyline, but at the same time, you see all of the great, the churches that most likely the Poles built. So I always was interested that like these immigrants would spend their free time to build these great churches. Free time and also without pay, I think. And they left this for my generation. Unfortunately, many of these cities many of the parts of Chicago that have these great churches, and sadly, they're closing a lot of them down. You can't really, they're too dangerous to go into now. And so now with the new suburban churches that you have, they're on the outskirts of town. They are not really well integrated into, it's like the mall is the center of things. And it just seems to me that the culture that maybe took form eventually was very, very much formed what the immigrants brought here. A great book on this, by the way, and I won't go too much longer, but is called, what's it called? Protestant Catholic Jew by William Herbert. And it was written back in the 1950s, I think, which he talks about the American Creed. And there he gives he was seeing a lot of this, like this new identity that was taking form. And so anyways, I encourage everybody to take a look at that book. But when I read that book, I felt like, yeah, this is what I grew up with. This is like the way I in some ways intuitively think about the world. And I started to critique that because it didn't seem to line up well with in some ways that my deepening of my I don't know, my deepening in my life in the church. So, anything you say about that?
Yeah, kind of. I was thinking about this just the other day because I'm working on this little book that I think should be coming out later this year. But I have a chapter in this book about why the Catholic Church is not a denomination. So the word denomination is nowhere to be found in any Catholic documents. That is just not the Catholic Church basically doesn't believe there are such things as denominations, right? There's just the church, and there's your degree of participation or degree of communion to it, right? But in some respects, in the United States, the success of Catholics, and particularly immigrant Catholics, to become integrated into American life has kind of been the worst thing for the Catholic Church in America, in a way, because I mean, even though going all the way back to like George Washington, I mean, he very much advocated for tolerance for Roman Catholics, and there were these enclaves in American society like Maryland and Kentucky, and then as urbanization happened, more and more of that was happening in America's big cities, right? But after World War I, and then very much after World War II, when so many Catholic Americans went and fought alongside Protestants and Jews, and they all came back and wanted to be one great big happy American family and enjoy America's prosperity, Catholicism really became a denomination. Like and in a sense, like that was the Catholic Church's moment to kind of that they've arrived. Like, it's like, oh, you go to a Methodist church, we go to a Catholic church. Great, whatever, who cares? We all, we all live in the suburbs and it's all fine, and
we all work for the same corporation.
Yeah, same corporation. We all, exactly, right? And in a way, of course, that's a that's a happy story, but it's also, I think we're beginning to really see how, in the long term, that has not been such a happy story, because we don't have then the same mark, like Menault talks about, that puts pressure upon us in a good way to live as Catholics, right? Or to live even as Christians. I mean, these other denominations, so-called, have the same problems. So yeah, but it's like, if you go to Europe still now, okay, maybe if you go to like a town like Reims in France, I read a little something about this in the same book. It's the main city in the Champagne region of France, east of Paris. There's a beautiful cathedral there, absolutely gorgeous. Everybody should go to Reims and check out this cathedral. I went there on this trip that I took with my dad and my sister in 1994. If you were to excavate Reims in hundreds of years, there would be no question that that cathedral was the most important place in that city. No
Yeah.
question, right? I mean, the whole city is organized around it. It's on this beautiful square. I mean, it is just clearly what the city is about, right? What would anybody think is the most important place in Dallas, Texas? What? I mean,
Cowboy Stadium? I don't know.
maybe, but I mean, that'll probably get knocked down
That's
in
going
a
to be
few
gone.
years.
Yeah.
They'll build it. It'll be the next iteration of Cowboy Stadium or like whatever, right? I mean, it's just different. America is just
Yeah.
different. And I think it's proving the versatility of the faith as a kind of like personal matter to be expressed and shared.
Yeah.
It's really up against its limits now, because there's just not enough kind of cultural force that can carry that along,
Yeah.
and so I guess that's part of what we're trying to do, is to point back across the Atlantic and say, look, Christianity has spread to the entire world, and that's a fact, but it has spread to the entire world because Peter and Paul went to Europe, right? Because Christendom was born there, because the Pope still is there,
Yeah.
right? Christianity and Europe are inextricably linked. And that's the case whether you still live in Europe, or you live in North America, or you live in the Philippines, or wherever it is that you live. And we're forgetting that, for all that we're excited about the faith in the Southern Hemisphere and kind of the new expressions of the ancient faith, the old expressions and certainly the roots of it are more important than ever.
Well, think about this, Andrew. I was thinking about this on the way home today. Because I was talking to a Dominican the other day, and he was talking about, like, how Marx says that it's the kind of material conditions that then in some ways create like the culture. But he was like challenging that as like saying, no, it's like the ideas, the spiritual condition that then creates the kind of like also the material conditions and the culture. But I was thinking like, okay, so what made it possible for Socrates to eventually, like, think about the beginnings of philosophy, which started with conversation and dialogue. But that only would have been possible if somebody thought too of actually having a certain space in which that has certain primacy, where people meet and talk in person, and are able to attend and not just leave like we do on our digital platforms, to an ongoing conversation, which then gave rise to these ideas, which then reinforced it, and that could highlight the significance of that, and then build and develop towns that not only have stuff like that possible, but also then see, like when Paul comes, I see that, you what does he say,
You're very
Andrew?
religious.
You're
Yeah,
very religious.
I
Yeah.
see that you're very religious, right?
So,
Yeah.
so this is like when you walk the streets of Krakow, I see that you are very religious people. And even though you are all on your cell phones, which, like, when I take the tram in every day, I see almost everyone having a cell phone, and not looking around them. It's still there, okay? And my big worry is that we're like losing the tangibility, like recognizing this tangibility of these things that are kind of in some ways ordered in a certain way, that we're losing that, and everything's just kind of becoming part of the flux, or just like, I don't know, just part of this, almost
Yeah.
like the cloud. I don't know. But I saw a man on the tram the other day, in which, well, everybody was having their cell phones out. he was holding a rosary just right there. And I started thinking, you know what? I see this an awful lot out here where
Mm.
there actually are a lot of people. Like, even if you have the driver who takes you into Krakow every day is just playing this like awful music that would make Roger Scruton like literally throw himself out of the bus for
Disco polo.
disc. Well, no, actually, I think disco polo is it's worse. Okay, it's trying to imitate this like sorry this American stuff, but it's always second rate. But it what was it? He's got all these holy cards and rosaries all over. I mean, every single bus driver still marks
Mhm.
up the driving space and the what do you call it? The anyways, the holy
Mhm.
cards. And you still have like nuns walking around in habits and priests, and you see it. Um, Kind of losing my train of thought, but you don't see that as much
Mhm.
in America. And
Yeah.
I think there's just even the idea that thought, well, maybe we should actually have cities in which the car is the very, very center of it all. Was not maybe there wasn't enough reaction against that. And thank goodness we had somebody like Jane Jacobs who, wrote the life and death of American cities, but who fought for something like, like Manhattan, not to have these huge highways just going through it, to make it car centric, to make it people centric. And so I think,
Yeah.
a lot of I'm so grateful that even though Europe tore itself apart in the two wars, it still has a lot of this stuff there that I think Americans can, like you and me, recognize.
Yeah. Yeah. A couple thoughts about that. One is when in my background, in my kind of Protestant, even evangelical Protestant background, I think I don't remember if it was explicitly said, but it was more or less implied that cultural Christianity was bad, right? That what the last thing you wanted was a version of Christianity that was just for show.
Mhm.
So in a sense, like the goal was to kind of get rid of that first so that then you could kind of build up in each individual a real personal faith. I have come to see that as just absolutely dead wrong. And
Mhm.
not only wrong, but just so wrong because it's not only counterintuitive, but I mean it is like it stands against kind of the very way we exist as human beings, right? Just
Mhm.
as you said about the example of Socrates with the conditions in, whatever it was, fourth century Athens to create that, right? Um, so yeah, so I mean, I think like one of the things that I think maybe the two of us together that we lament is the lack of cultural Catholicism in America that is still strangely on display in some parts of Europe anyway, where maybe the personal part is one has never really been taught. But two, just kind of, as you say, like, okay, the guy's like, listening to whatever garbage music, but he still kind of understands himself to be embedded in this culture that even if that's the music he's flipping on, he's still in the culture of, whatever it is, Saint Faustina and John Paul II and, whatever, the whole rich tradition of Polish Catholicism or Christianity. The other thing I'd say is I think that one of the things I hope that we can do in the Space Alvey Institute is to continue to kind of like be this like small, small beacon of light that has been lit long ago off the big torch that was lit in Europe, precisely because Europe itself is going to be going through I think, increasing challenges over the next few years with regard to this continuation of the identity of Christianity. Here's an example.
Mhm.
So the example that I keep coming back to is the example of Notre Dame in Paris. And I hope that we're going to have Billy Newton on in the near future to talk to us about that a little bit more, because I
Yeah.
actually think that the case of, first of all, I don't know how you felt, but when I saw Notre Dame burn in 2019, it was one of the most traumatic things I've ever seen. I mean, I know that sounds maybe like a little bit fetishist or
No, I
something, of like
agree
a,
with you.
you know,
I,
I just couldn't believe it. I mean, if you had asked me the day before, what's the one place on the planet Earth we cannot do without? I think probably if I had thought long enough about it, I would have said Notre Dame. I really couldn't imagine a more, like, both to me personally, having been to Paris a few times, and just as a kind of icon of the history of Christianity and the faith of the faith that now exists worldwide. I mean, that is the building that Kenneth Clark pointed to, right, in the Civilization series. At the beginning of his famous Civilization documentary, he's standing in front of Notre Dame and he says, when you ask me what
That's right.
civilization is, all I can do is tell you what it looks like. I think I'm paraphrasing, but I mean, that is literally what he says. This is civilization, right?
And there it is, or something like
And there
that.
it is, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And now, again, I think it was, you mentioned DC Schindler before. I think it was when we talked to Schindler that Schindler thought that Charles Péguy had said somewhere that the very stones of Notre Dame will be in the heavenly Jerusalem or something like
Yeah,
that,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Which I think is probably true. I think that's just such a wonderful thought. Um, but the challenges that are being faced right now, like, okay, so this thing, nobody would have, the French government, for example, never would have come along, even during the revolution, right? They tried, but even
Mhm.
during the revolution, they weren't able to just say, we're knocking this thing down. This isn't who we are anymore, right? But whatever it was, however this fire started, took them a little ways down the road of essentially having to make that decision. What is this thing going to be now that we have this challenge and opportunity of either rebuilding it or not, either, how we're going to refurbish it, like all that sort of thing? Is it going to continue to be what it has been, or are we going to like try self-consciously to make it into something it has never been before? So I'll leave it at that and throw it back to you. But I just think we want to be here on the sidelines cheering, like not
Yeah.
necessarily because we're like antiquarian, like, oh no, everything has to be put back the same way it was. No, but we're on the sideline as cheerleaders saying this great icon, this symbol of who we are has to remain. It has to.
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, it's not so much being antiquarian, but recognizing the goodness of it and its beauty, and ultimately, yeah, the truth. That as an icon, it points us to it points us ultimately to union with Christ. I mean, so I think that we see that in Europe. And I remember, because I was teaching a church history class, when Notre Dame, like, however it started, but was on fire, and somebody told me this, and I felt like, yeah, I mean, okay, we turned on YouTube, and I'm like, oh my gosh, everything is just going up in flames, and I was thinking, like, those stained glass windows, okay, what is going to happen to them? And the kids, actually, because I showed them parts of Kenneth Clark, his Civilization series. So they saw the kind of the beauty. They never didn't. I don't think any of them went to Paris and beheld Notre Dame, but they saw, like, wow, what is happening? But when I saw the designs coming out for uh for it, it was almost like, oh, please, this is what we're going to give the future generations.
Yeah.
It made me appalled. It made me think of, I mean, Soldiers Field in Chicago is nothing close to Notre Dame, but it just made me think of the new Soldiers Field, which looks like a UFO descended
Hmm.
in Soldiers Field, because they try to blend. Anyways, but yeah, I think that the project is also, like we said in the beginning, to help Europeans to recognize what they have and to
Hmm.
cherish that. And also, it's a way to, like, people like you and me, Andrew, who are incredibly interested um, in civilization and culture that came to blossom in Europe. And not all of it is Christian, but to highlight the concrete Christian elements there, to gather people like you and me, and appreciate that, and maybe bring some stuff like that to America, but not do it in some kind of cheesy way. And I mean, I saw this video the other day in which they had, like, oh, how do I do it? How do I say this? They had a little statue of the Pietà, And they had some like, you know, Corinthian columns behind them. And I thought this is just as ugly and horrible as like a cheap David statue in your front lawn. Um,
Hmm.
and so we need to get William Newton on though to talk about the Pietà and the David itself, because
Yeah.
I've heard that actually that he perhaps maybe doesn't like them that much.
Mm.
But but
Well, we'll
anyways,
save that for him to tell us, but
yeah.
that's a provocative thought. Yeah.
But don't you think, Andrew, that sometimes like Catholics who are also interested in these things kind of end up like making like another cheap copy of it just for this kind of new cult, like in some ways like Catholic cultural industry. And it in some ways devalues the whole thing, where it's like, in
Yeah.
fact, part of the reasons I don't want to have much like Catholicism, like marks on the whole Space Salvi logo, is just to stay away from some of that stuff.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I mean, obviously, we've named our organization after an encyclical by a pope, so it is embedded. Its meaning is like embedded in
Yeah.
the church itself. But it's in a way that I think is, um, it's the, I guess, well, we created it, so we did it that way for a reason. We want it embedded in that way, we've already run into the obstacle that some people don't, they don't know Latin, and so, they're not even really sure what it's space salvi. I mean, what is that? But that'll be part of the
Yeah.
task for us is to talk about the document and for us to talk about hope, spe, and salvi, all of that, salvation and saved in hope. Um, I think that the one thing that we put in our manifesto that we're going to be really working on soon is, you talked before about kind of encounter, real life, in person stuff, right? And one of the challenges that we're going to have to explore is we're not just trying to be a tour group, or we're not, as you said before, we're not trying to kind of do evangelism within a marketing category. We are we are interested in identity, in belonging, right? In culture, in the reframing of culture to some degree. So as we look to our fellow North Americans, what we are interested in doing is bringing them with us on a pilgrimage, in a sense, and not just one pilgrimage. We may do those, or one trip, or one conference, or one study tour, or whatever it may be, but that the whole idea itself is one of pilgrimage. And it seems to me there's never been a better time, despite Europe's major challenges at the moment with Islamism and with, the sad fact that they seem to want to import American style wokeism and like all these kinds of things. Um, the fact that the very nature of what it means to be a European is up in the air right now is, I think, an opportunity for us to say, here we are. Every Christian on the planet Earth is, in a sense, a European.
Mhm.
And we need to reconnect with that identity. It has nothing to do with race, skin color, right? I mean, it has everything to do with the very nature of Europe from its beginning as the Roman Empire fell, which is its identity as the place Christians live, right? And so now the whole world is the place where Christians live. But we can't lose our connection to our origins.
No, that's right. That's right. It's funny you say that anybody who's Christian in some sense is a European.
Yeah.
Um, I have to get this guy's name right, but I just today I discovered an author. He's a South Korean writer. He lives in Germany. In fact, he's pretty well known in Germany as a culture theorist. He has some things, I guess, in like the Frankfurt School, but I had a period off, and my classroom was being occupied, so I had to go somewhere. And literally a couple steps away from my school is a bookstore. Now, this used bookstore is pretty progressive, and but nevertheless, you could find some good things there. And I found the book of this guy. I've seen his name a couple times, but I never looked into his books. I think his name is Buyang something Han. And he comes from South Korea, but he went to Germany for a PhD in philosophy, and he studied Heidegger's understanding of Stimmung. And so I went and I like just Googled his name, and I read like a little bit about him and his background, and it said that he's Catholic.
Hmm.
And I was so intrigued. So I was looking a little bit more about him, and I started reading his book called Non-Things, on this new kind of digital landscape. It seems like a number of his books have been translated in the last like 3 years. But his insights on just the culture today, it seems like he's very much rooted in this kind of like Catholic sensibility,
Hmm.
which is also like, I mean, he brings in a lot of like kind of things with like Asian culture, but made me think of like what C.S. Lewis is getting at with the Tao.
Hmm.
And so, but he advocates this kind of slowness, the kind of like he is not online. He, I guess, spends most of his days, he's now 65 or something like that, just watering his pants, not his pants, his plants. Oh gosh,
Oh
Freudian
dear.
slip.
Yeah.
But actually, his books are right next to the Freud section. But
Uh,
anywho, his plants, and he
uh-huh.
just walks around and all that, takes life easy. But he kind of, what he likes, it seems, about some aspects of European culture is this kind of slowness. And I was thinking
Mm.
that, with all these new imports and all these new technologies, we're just like constantly on. And it totally is leading to a way of life and a culture that is in a way against prayer. And so,
Yeah.
anyways, this word Stimmung, Andrew, I think we'll have to eventually explore this thing. I've got a
Yeah.
book over there, just analyzing that word. But it seems to me
Hmm.
like kind of what we're getting at a little bit is when you come to these places, you in a way partake in certain, I don't know how to call it, but like certain vibrations, and you enter into this like, if you want to say like heavenly fabric of things.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the places themselves don't invite you into them as if you are a tourist. And the
Yeah.
proof of that is our long-term attachment to these places, right? Like
Hmm.
my feeling about Notre Dame or about St. Paul's Cathedral or whatever is not at all the same as how I feel about having gone on the London Eye or about having, I don't know, gone to Disneyland Paris or something like that, right? I mean, they invite you into belonging. And maybe a good place to end, at least for my part, is
Yeah.
an important book to me that that's really bowled me over the last year or so is this book right here, Eccentric Culture: A Theory of Western Civilization by Remy Bragg.
Well, you have that
You have
literally
it
right
too,
next to me. I've got his other book,
right?
which
So
is The
Remy,
Wisdom of the World. Yeah.
I very much hope we'll have a chance to talk to Remy Bragg. I've emailed with him, and we have mutual friends, I think, but I'm not really sure how much podcasting he does. But his thought is, I think, just so important for our understanding of kind of the possibility of the renewal of Christian society, and this question of European identity is a really really important one. We put a quote from Eccentric Culture in our manifesto, by the way,
Mhm.
where Bragg talks about, I think, people kind of like us, people who have every right, I suppose, by virtue of their baptism, if nothing else. In our case, maybe a little more because we could sort of have a family history of having at one time come from the continent itself. But he really posits the idea that to be a European is something other than just to be presently from that place on the globe. And he says in the book, let me see if I can find it in our manifesto. Um, well, I kind of snipped it, but basically, I'll read the sentence that we wrote in our manifesto. As Remy Bragg notes in his important study, Eccentric Culture, it may be that geographical non-Europeans may now be in a unique position, quote, to become more European than those who believe themselves to be European.
Mhm.
Um, Now, we're not trying to move in on the people who have lived there their whole lives and whose families go back. We're not trying to say, hey, get out of the way. We're the real deal. But we definitely do want to join them, and and to say we're in this together, and we have a project before us, namely the project of the renewal of Christian civilization, which I have no compunction whatsoever about saying is the greatest civilization in the history of the world. And so, yeah, we're going to fight for it. Why shouldn't we? I mean, it's our duty, you know?
Yeah. I mean, if at the heart of it is partaking in the divine life,
Yeah.
it just seems like anybody can partake in that, and that ultimately is what you're a part of. But kind of, I know we want to wrap things up, but I've been thinking an awful lot too about because I have to teach this theology of the body course in the summer, and I was just listening to an interesting lecture on how John Paul II developed his philosophy of the body, which you don't really hear much about. And I have to go and read some about that in his Lublin lectures before developing the theology of the body. But it's interesting that John Paul II was incredibly attentive to the material way in the structure, the way in which we're in some ways set up. And like you have a great person like is it Leon Cass, okay,
Mhm.
who wrote this book called The Hungry Soul, in which he talks about the way that the human body is set up in a certain way that makes these things possible. The way that the human eye is actually designed that makes a certain degree of certain possibilities can be realized because of this. And I was thinking that, in a way, the same thing goes for like cities. The way that they're structured, things can come out of those cities that maybe won't be realized elsewhere. But also think about it this way, when we're baptized, we're literally grafted onto the body of Christ.
Mhm.
But you look at like the Bible taking this material like from Abraham through David to
Mhm.
the Christ very seriously, and
Yeah.
so it's not like you have to be born in this specific genetic line, but yet this genetic line made this very thing possible. So,
Mhm.
we were talking about how maybe in Protestantism, we've lost a sense of that being grafted onto like a body,
Mhm.
as primary. And you can correct me if I'm wrong with that, but it seems that like the primary thing is in Catholicism, the church, which is like a matrix, kind of the material conditions in which you become the very thing you've been grafted onto. So,
Yep.
anyways, I know that's my thoughts are all over the place, but
No, I think that's an important point. Yeah, I mean, Protestantism certainly has a certain, at least a caricature of it, or a form of it um, is not. Yeah, you're grafted into something, but it isn't really something visible.
yeah.
And what we're saying is it's visible. It's, yeah, just like it was for ancient Israel, so it is for us in the Catholic Church. And these places, these spaces, culture itself, the way that we do things, the way that we whatever cook, the way all these things are in a sense like inherent to our identity as sons and daughters of God, right?
What wines we drink on specific feast
Right.
days.
Yeah. And that's all the stuff that we're just so interested in. On that note, Bobby, I think we are about out of time. I'm really grateful for this conversation that we've had, and I hope our listeners are willing to bear with us as we do this sort of thing. We're on a journey, and so some of the stuff we've talked about today it's a real pleasure actually to get to hear, Bobby, certain reflections that you have from your own
Yeah,
personal
likewise.
experiences. Yeah, and it's fun to get to do that. And we hope that our listeners will that the stuff that we talk about, whether it's this conversation or our guests or the things that we write or whatever it may be, that they will bring to our work their own experience as well. And in a sense, well, we've already said it, to join us on this pilgrimage that we're undertaking. So any final words, Bobby?
No, because it's going to take us off in another conversation, but we'll save that for later.
Yeah, we'll do this again very soon. Until next time, thank you all for listening. Please don't forget to subscribe, share, give us a 5-star review. Check out our website, spacealviinstitute.com. Subscribe to our emails and be on the lookout for new content coming your way before too long in the form of newsletter stuff. So we're just starting out on our journey, and we're so happy that you are with us. Until next time, God bless and live in hope.